My name is Norah Steen, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a registered nurse at a regional hospital in Sudbury, Ontario, and for the past 11 years I have taken every extra shift I could get my hands on. Not to buy a new car, not to renovate our kitchen, even though my husband kept sending me links to countertop samples from the Home Depot flyer like I was going to suddenly care. Not for vacations. Every single dollar from my overtime, from the 2 weekends a month I picked up in the ICU when they were short-staffed, from the tutoring I did for nursing students on my days off. All of it went into a savings account I named simply Mom and Dad in my banking app. I never moved money out of it. Not once in 11 years. My parents, Greta and Harold, have been married for 48 years. They raised me and my younger brother in a small house in Copper Cliff, a town so small most people in Ontario have never heard of it, about 15 minutes from Sudbury. My father worked at the Vale Nickel Refinery for 26 years. Not a glamorous job, not a well-paying one in those early decades, and one that left him with a hearing aid at 58 and a lower back problem he never once complained about in front of us. My mother cleaned houses, other people's houses, for most of my childhood, and then when her knees started giving her trouble in her late 50s, she switched to working the cash register at a local grocery co-op 3 days a week because she said she needed something to do, and she was too stubborn to just sit home. They never owned property. Not once in 48 years. They rented the same house in Copper Cliff for 19 years, then moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in Sudbury when the landlord sold the property and the new owners tripled the rent. That apartment was fine. It was small, and the building smelled like someone had been cooking the same soup for 30 years. But it was theirs, and they made it feel like home, the way my parents always made everything feel like home. With thrift store frames and my mother's quilts and my father's little radio on the kitchen windowsill playing CBC every morning. But they'd always talked about the lake. Not in a wistful, dramatic way. They weren't people who made a show of longing. It was more like a recurring detail in small conversations. How my father used to fish at Lake Wanapitei when he was young. How my mother said there was something about waking up near water that just made the whole day feel different. How they'd driven out past the French River once when I was about 12, and my mother had just stood at the water's edge for a full 5 minutes, not saying anything, just looking. I found the property 16 months ago. A small 3-bedroom cottage on a lot backing onto a quiet bay off Georgian Bay near Parry Sound. Old house, but solid. The kind of old that meant good bones rather than bad news. It had a screened porch running the full length of the back, looking straight out over the water. The listing was $389,000. I had $301,000 in the account. I took out the rest against my pension contributions, talked to my bank about a small bridge loan, and closed on it with my brother as the only other person on the planet who knew. The plan was this. Their 48th anniversary fell on a long weekend in late August. I booked them a night at a bed and breakfast in Parry Sound under the pretense of a surprise anniversary trip. I told them I was taking them somewhere nice and to pack for 2 nights. My brother, who lives in Barrie, was supposed to drive up separately, meet my husband at the cottage, and spend the Friday getting everything ready while I drove our parents up from Sudbury. My husband, Patrick, not the one in the file, a different Patrick, mine, had taken the Friday off work, driven up to Parry Sound Thursday night, and was supposed to meet my brother-in-law there. I say supposed to because his family, specifically his mother and his older brother, had insisted on helping. They'd heard, through some version of a conversation I never intended for them to have, that we were doing something big at a property near Parry Sound, and they had shown up. I should explain something about my mother-in-law before I go any further, because I think context matters here. She is not a cruel woman in the way that some people are cruel. She doesn't yell. She doesn't make scenes in public. She operates with a kind of gracious, smiling, methodical control that is somehow worse than yelling, because it's so much harder to point to. For the 9 years Patrick and I have been together, she has done things like mention that she was surprised I'd chosen nursing over medicine, given my grades, as if nursing were a consolation prize. She said things like she hoped we'd eventually get something a bit more in a family neighborhood when we mentioned our apartment, even though she has never seen our apartment. She referred to my parents once, at a Christmas dinner, as salt of the earth in a tone that made it sound like she was describing a type of soil rather than a compliment. I had always absorbed it. Patrick would apologize, promise to talk to her, and then sort of not quite get around to it in any meaningful way. I understood. She was his mother, and it was uncomfortable, and I genuinely believed that as long as I was the only one being ground down by it, I could manage. What I did not understand was what she was capable of when she thought something of value was within reach. I picked up my parents that Saturday morning. My mother wore her good blouse, the green one she saves for occasions. My father had polished his shoes. They thought we were going to Parry Sound for a nice lunch and maybe a walk, and my mother had brought her sunscreen and her reading glasses and a little cloth bag with 2 oranges in it, because she always brings snacks when someone else is driving, and she doesn't want to be a burden. The drive from Sudbury to Parry Sound is about 2.5 hours. My mother held my hand most of the way and asked questions about the area, about the town, about whether we'd need to find a pharmacy, because my father had forgotten his blood pressure prescription back on the counter. I told her there was a Shoppers just off James Street and we'd figure it out. My father navigated from memory even though he hadn't been to Parry Sound in years, pointing out a turnoff he remembered from a fishing trip in the 90s, describing the color of the sky over the bay as we got close to the water. I turned onto the gravel road that led to the property, and my heart was going fast in the way it does before you do something irreversible. I had imagined this moment probably 300 times in 16 months. I had imagined my mother's face when she saw the porch. I had imagined my father walking down to the water's edge for the first time and standing there the way my mother had stood at the French River all those years ago. I had not imagined what was actually waiting for us at the end of that road. The first thing I noticed was the truck in the driveway that did not belong to my brother. It was my brother-in-law's truck. The second thing I noticed was that the back porch, the screened porch I had specifically asked Patrick to leave empty until we arrived, so my parents could see it first, had furniture on it. Not my furniture. A large outdoor sectional in a dark gray fabric, a wrought iron side table, a bar cart that I had never seen before in my life. And standing at the top of the porch steps holding a glass of what appeared to be iced tea was my mother-in-law. My mother got out of the car first. She was smiling because she always smiles when she doesn't know what's happening yet. That reflexive politeness, that is one of the most decent things about her. She got 3 steps up the path, and my mother-in-law looked at her over the rim of her glass and said pleasantly but very clearly, "This is actually a private property, so I'm going to have to ask you to wait by the car." My mother stopped walking. She didn't say anything. She looked at me. There was a look on her face I had only seen once before, when she'd come to my hospital after I had a small procedure in my early 20s, and she'd walked into the room, not knowing quite what she was going to find. A look of suspension, of waiting to understand what she was supposed to feel. My father stepped up beside her and put his hand on her arm gently and looked at my mother-in-law with an expression of careful, quiet confusion. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think there might be a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," my mother-in-law said with that same pleasant firmness. "We're in the middle of getting the property set up. If you're here about the road access, you'd want to speak with the municipality." The road access. She told my father, who had worked in a refinery for 26 years and cleaned his shoes that morning, to come on a trip he didn't fully understand, that he could call the municipality about the road access. I was still standing by the car. I had not moved. My throat had closed in the way it does when you are confronted with something that your brain recognizes as serious before your body has caught up. I could see through the screened porch to the inside of the cottage, where there were boxes, actual moving boxes, labeled in black marker, stacked against the wall in what was supposed to be my parents' living room. There was a rug rolled up in the hallway that wasn't mine. There was a coat rack by the door I had never purchased. I walked past my mother-in-law without looking at her and went inside. My husband was in the kitchen, holding a coffee mug, talking to his brother, and when he heard my footsteps on the hardwood he turned around. I have been with Patrick for 9 years. I can read him the way you read a weather system you've lived with long enough to know what it's doing before it knows itself. And what I read in his face in that moment was not guilt. It was not defiance. It was the expression of someone who had done the math incorrectly and only just arrived at the wrong answer. "Norah," he said, "I set my keys down on the kitchen counter that I had paid for. I need you to tell me what is happening in this house." He started to say something about a conversation that had gone a different direction than he intended. About his mother offering to help set up, about how she'd mentioned wanting to contribute to the property in some way, about how he'd maybe suggested she could come up early to handle some of the decorating, because he knew I was going to be driving. "The decorating," I said, "the decorating." She offered to handle the decorating, and I thought it would be one less thing, Patrick. I said his name the way I say a patient's name when I need them to stop talking and look at me. My parents are standing outside. My mother just got told to wait by the car at a house I bought for her. There are moving boxes in the living room. There is a bar cart on the back porch. So I need you to answer one question, and I need you to answer it very carefully. He waited. Did you tell your mother this cottage was going to be part of a family investment property? He didn't answer right away, and the not answering was its own answer. What had happened, I learned in the following 20 minutes, was this. Patrick had mentioned the property purchase to his mother sometime in the spring, in the context of explaining why we were being careful with money that year. He had said, at some point in a conversation he had clearly not thought through, that the property near Georgian Bay was an investment that the family could benefit from eventually. He did not mean his family. Or at least, he said he didn't mean his family. But the word family had entered a conversation with his mother, and his mother had held on to it with both hands, and had spent the months between spring and August quietly and efficiently deciding that family meant the Holloways. She had not told Patrick she was bringing furniture. She had not told Patrick she was bringing his brother, who was apparently under the impression that he was getting a standing invitation to use the cottage on alternating long weekends. She had not told Patrick that she'd already described the property to her sister as a family retreat. She had simply arrived, the way she always arrived, with a plan fully formed and a gracious smile, and the deep and total confidence that the world would reorganize itself around her expectations. I walked back out to the porch. My mother was sitting on the top step, which broke something in me that I am still not entirely sure is fully repaired. She was sitting on the step of her own house with her little cloth bag still over her wrist because she hadn't put it down. My father was standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder, and he was talking to her quietly in the way he talks, when he is trying to make something upsetting feel smaller. My mother-in-law was still on the porch with her iced tea. I looked at her for a moment. She met my eyes. And I recognized something in her face in that moment. Not malice, exactly. Not the expression of someone who has been caught doing something they know is wrong. It was something more like puzzlement. The faint, genuine surprise of someone who cannot understand why the room is not responding the way it usually does. This property, I said, loud enough for everyone present to hear, including my parents on the step below, was purchased entirely with my money. 11 years of nursing overtime and weekend shifts and tutoring nursing students on my days off. It is registered in my name. It is a gift from me to my parents for their 48th wedding anniversary, and they are going to spend the rest of their lives here if they choose to. My mother looked up at me. You are not family investors, I said to my mother-in-law, and this is not a Holloway property. I would like your furniture, your boxes, and your bar cart off this porch within the hour. Silence. My brother-in-law appeared in the doorway behind her. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, and he took up most of the frame, and in that moment he looked much smaller than he was. He looked at my mother. He looked at the cloth bag still hanging off her wrist. He stepped back inside without saying anything. Patrick came out from the kitchen and stood behind me, slightly to my left. He didn't touch my arm. He didn't say anything to his mother. But he stood there, in that spot, and his being in that spot rather than in the kitchen or beside his mother meant something. It meant the only thing that mattered in that moment. His mother put down her iced tea very carefully on the wrought iron table that was not staying on my porch. I was only trying to make sure the family had a place to gather, she said. Her voice had lost its pleasantness now, not angry. Just quieter, the tone of someone recalibrating. Then gather somewhere you're invited, Patrick said. I had waited 9 years to hear him say something like that with that particular flatness. I had not expected it to happen on a screened porch in Parry Sound, but here we were. It took 45 minutes. My brother-in-law carried boxes. My mother-in-law carried smaller things, a lamp, a decorative tray, a set of folded throw blankets in a shade of blue I would not have chosen in 1,000 years. Patrick helped load the truck. He didn't say much, neither did his brother. His mother made one more attempt halfway through to suggest that they could work out a schedule, some kind of shared arrangement. There is no schedule, I said. There is no arrangement. Please take your things. When the truck finally pulled down the gravel road, I stood at the edge of the driveway for a moment and let the quiet settle. My brother had arrived by then, in the middle of the chaos, having misjudged the drive from Barry and hit construction on the 400. He stood beside me at the end of the driveway, watching the truck disappear, and said, "I leave for 3 hours." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed all day. We rehung the string lights I'd put up 2 days earlier and taken down in the chaos. My brother found the photo boards I'd made, 48 years of my parents' lives printed and matted, spanning from their wedding photo in 1976 to a picture I'd taken of them sit at their kitchen table last Christmas. And we set them up on the folding tables, along the porch railing. And I put out the food I'd had catered from a restaurant in Parry Sound that made my mother's favorite kind of food, simple and good and unpretentious. And then I walked down to where my parents were sitting on the grass near the water, where they had drifted while the unloading was happening, the two of them side by side in the low lawn chairs my brother had brought, looking out at the bay. I sat down between them and I told them. I told them about the account, about the 11 years, about the overtime and the tutoring, and the way I had calculated for a long time that the thing I most wanted to give them was the thing they had spent their whole lives almost having. I told my father about how I remembered him parking the car far from the beach because the closer lots cost too much, and how I had thought about that parking lot more times than he would probably believe. My mother did not say anything for a long time. She put both her hands around mine and looked out at the water. Then she said, "Harold, do you see this?" And my father said, "I see it, Greta." My mother cried, not briefly, properly for a while, with her head against my shoulder, and I let her because there was nothing to do except let her. My father sat very still, the way he always sits still when something lands on him that is too large for words, and eventually he got up quietly and walked down to the water's edge and stood there with his hands in his pockets for a long time, looking out at the bay in the low evening light. My brother came and sat in the grass beside us and didn't say anything either, which was the exactly right thing to do. Later, much later, after we'd eaten and my parents had walked through every room in the house, and my mother had cried again, briefly, in the doorway of the bedroom that would be hers, my father came back to the porch and sat in one of the new chairs. The right chairs, the ones we'd brought, not the gray sectional that was now in the back of his truck. And he looked out at the water in the dark and said to no one in particular, 48 years. He meant it the way he means everything that matters to him, completely, without explanation, without needing anyone to respond. Patrick sat down beside me on the porch steps later that night after my parents had gone inside. We didn't say much for a while. He told me he was sorry. Not in the complicated, qualified way he sometimes apologized for his family. A sorry with conditions attached. A sorry followed by a "but she means well" or a "you know how she is." Just sorry. I told him I knew. He said he was going to call his mother the next day, and that the conversation was going to be uncomfortable, and that he was going to have it anyway. I told him I'd believe it when I saw it, but that I appreciated him saying it. He laughed a little, which was the right response. My parents spent their first night in that house on the last Saturday of August. I could see my mother's light on past midnight through the bedroom window because she keeps the same hours she's always kept. Early to rise, late to sleep, always a few pages of a book before she turns out the lamp. My father's light went out at 10:30 exactly, as it has every night for as long as I can remember. I drove back to Sudbury the next morning. On my way out, I stood on the porch for a few minutes looking at the bay, which in the early morning was perfectly flat and the color of old pewter and ringed with pines. I thought about my father parking 2 blocks from the water when I was a kid, so we wouldn't have to pay for the closer spot. I thought about my mother standing at the French River with her shoes in the sand for 5 minutes, not saying anything. I thought about the fact that neither of them had asked, not once in my entire childhood, for anything more than what they had. I locked the door. I put the key, their key, not a copy, not a spare, theirs, under the mat where my father would find it when he came out to get the newspaper. I walked to my car, and for the first time in 11 years, the savings account in my banking app, the one labeled Mom and Dad, sat at 0. It was the best 0 I have ever seen.